I've also started talking to the nurseries that I get my stock from and telling them that it's important to me to have diversity in the species I buy, and that's valuable to me and I'm willing to pay more. I'm hoping that opening this conversation, if they hear that from enough people, I know they're thinking about these things themselves, they're going to find that it's cost effective to really increase the genetic diversity in the species that they're putting out there.
Hey, I'm Michael Yadrick. Welcome back to Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm an ecological restoration practitioner living on unceded Puyallup territory now known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington. On this episode, we discuss how restoration practitioners are adapting to climate change. If you have a few minutes, I would be grateful if you could complete a short listener survey I put together. One can find the link right now in the show description in your app, the Tree Hugger website, or the Tree Hugger Instagram profile. There are just a few short questions about preferred length of the episodes, where you found me, your desires, and what you might dislike about the show. If you submit something and drop your mailing address, I'll send you a Tree Hugger sticker. Thanks for your time. I think the answers you contribute will improve your listening and learning experience while also powering future content. So on this episode, I'm bringing you a recording of a session I took part in from the January 19th virtual North Sound Riparian Conference. This event was hosted by the good people at the Skagit Watershed Council, Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group, and Skagit River System Cooperative. So when I say sound, that means Puget Sound, or the southern estuary of the Salish Sea, connected to the wider Pacific Ocean via the Strait of Georgia and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Most of the folks attending the conference were in the North Sound, about 100 miles north of me, and I was graciously invited to join. Even though this might not be the ecosystem you're working in, I think the information we discuss will be relevant to you because almost all of us are addressing similar challenges. Lots of smart people were presenting and listening in on this conference. This event was recorded, so if you want to watch it, the recording will be posted on the Skagit Watershed Council's website, which is skagitwatershed.org. I will put a link in the show description and show notes found at treehuggerpod.com. The morning session presenters and topics cover the following. Dave Peterson, who's a professor of forest ecology at University of Washington, talked about building forest resilience in a changing climate. So he provided a great context for what's happening in the Pacific Northwest and some strategies about building resilience in our forests. Also, Deborah Rogers, who's Director of Conservation Science and Stewardship at the Center for Natural Lands Management, discussed climate change genetics, which was awesome. Then Dominique Bachelet, who is a professor at Oregon State University, went over the use of the seed lot selection tool. And then also Denise Crownbell, who is at Seattle City Light, covered data from an assisted migration planting that is generally referred to as the Stossel Creek Project. So those sessions were in the morning. They were great. Check them out if you have some time. So Brenda Clifton was down to record the conversation that we had during our half-an-hour session. She is senior restoration botanist at the Skagit River System Cooperative, and we talked about adjusting our plant restoration practices for climate change. So really it was a pretty small but concise discussion. I think it translates pretty well into podcast format. We cover a couple of key adaptation tactics for transitioning forests and restoration through climate transitions. Brenda is a plant ecologist with over 20 years of experience in plant biology and propagation. She has a bachelor's degree in botany and her master's thesis in plant physiology. She is a certified professional wetland scientist with the Society of Wetland Scientists. She has worked for the Skagit River System Cooperative for over 10 years. Brenda manages the vegetation aspects of salmonid habitat restoration, including developing planting, vegetation management, maintenance, and monitoring plans. She also runs a nursery with over 15,000 plants. So more on the Skagit River System Cooperative. This entity provides natural resource management services for the Sauk-Suiattle Indian Tribe and the Swinomish Indian Tribal Community. On behalf of these two sovereign nations, the cooperative works to actively improve fisheries management within their usual and accustomed fishing areas in the Skagit and Salish River basins. Habitat restoration is part of fisheries management, which also includes harvest and hatchery management, research, and more. And I realized I haven't directly talked about my day job on the podcast before. Just so you know, my story is up on treehuggerpod.com, but here's my quick bio as it relates to this session. For the past 10 years, I have served on a small team in Seattle Parks and Recreation supporting Green Seattle Partnership. The partnership was originally conceptualized as a 20-year program to restore 2,500 acres of forested parkland within the city. We are now in year 16 and have worked more than 1,800 acres of our urban forests. We have seen 1 million volunteer hours dedicated to the effort and planted over 1 million native plants. I'm one of the plant ecologists. When I first came on, I supported the community-based restoration efforts. Now I focus more on directing the work of professional crews on the steep slope and wetland restorations. Most recently, we have really ramped up our climate readiness work, looking forward to transitioning our forests through the mid to late century warming and associated impacts we expect. So this topic is really relevant to my interests right now, and I was happy that Brenda was down to record the conversation. So she and I cover 6 key adaptation tactics we are putting into play in our restorations. Those are increasing genetic diversity, increasing species diversity, assisted migration. So the caveat about this term, we both are not expanding species beyond their current range. So listen on for more about that. Increasing stewardship timelines, growing our networks, and planning for landslides. And that's it. There were a few questions at the end which we responded to, which I captured on the episode as well. It starts right here. Enjoy this conversation between me and Brenda Clifton.
So Michael and I are just going to talk a little bit about how we've taken some of the concepts that we learned earlier today and tried to implement them into our riparian revegetation programs. I had been wanting to start to think about adapting my program to climate change for about 10 years, but I felt it was really daunting. How am I going to plant trees that survive today and will also survive in changing climate? But a few years ago, I really started doing some research, mostly with the people that you heard presenting earlier, and found that there's really some down-to-earth things I can do to start addressing climate change in our region. So I'm going to go over some of mine, and Michael's going to go over some of his. One thing I'm really focusing on is increasing the amount of genetic diversity in our plantings. I'm mostly focused still on using genetic plants that are genetically sourced in the watershed I'm working in, so the Skagit Watershed, but I would really like to increase the diversity within those plants. I've worked in nurseries quite a bit before my current role, and I know that it's not necessarily the most cost-effective thing to do to get a lot of genetic diversity in your seed source. It's more cost-effective to get your seeds from one plant and to get them all at one time. And so thinking that maybe the plant material I'm getting from nurseries isn't the most genetic diverse, I'm making a point to buy plant material from several different nurseries. I think they may get some of their conifers from the same place, but I think they all have programs for collecting deciduous seeds. So I think that helps get more genetic diversity out at my sites. We've also hired Inside Passage to collect some seeds for us from the watershed. We have a nursery with 10 to 15,000 plants. We usually use our nursery stock for potted stock for plants in the fall and then buy bare root stock for the spring. And so we have Inside Passage collecting species throughout the watershed, and we're really trying to target some of the outlying populations with that, ones we think will be well adapted to climate change. So like in Darrington, there's some really well-drained soils, and it's particularly droughty up there, so we're trying to get seeds from Darrington. I have some sites that are flooded all winter. We're trying to get, these sites that have a lot of flooding. I've also started talking to the nurseries that I get my stock from and telling them that it's important to me to have genetic diversity in the species I buy, and that's valuable to me, and I'm willing to pay more. I'm hoping that opening this conversation, if they hear that from enough people, I know they're thinking about these things themselves, they're going to find that it's cost effective to really increase the genetic diversity in the species that they're putting out there. We're also doing just a little bit of assisted migration. About 10% of the plants that we are planting out are from Hoquiam. That's where the seed lot tool recommended. And it was a combination of where the seed lot tool recommended and where I could get seed from. And so those are conifer seeds, and we're growing them in our nursery to try and do just about 10%. I'm really worried that the assisted migration plants won't survive well now. And so that's why I'm kind of just doing a small percentage of them to, hopefully increase the amount of genetic diversity that's at the site.
Yeah, thanks, Brenda. I was just going to jump in there. I think we hear this term a lot, like hedging our bets. And I feel like that's what you're doing is like you have a certain amount of control over what you grow in your nursery, but it's sort of like depending on the market, the nurseries are able to respond, but also utilizing kind of the seed collector, you have a lot of flexibility that you've built into the program.
Yeah, another thing I do, because I'm trying to do this in a practical manner, is when I'm out visiting my sites, if I see a plant that has collectible seeds, I'll just collect them, and that just adds that much more genetic diversity to what we're putting out there. I'm also trying to really pay attention to the species diversity at each site. We do about 70% of our plants conifers because we're trying to get large woody debris and shade. But within those conifers, I try and make sure that every species that's appropriate to the site and appropriate to the area is represented, really taking advantage of microclimates at the site, small wet areas to get in my cedars and whatever small amount of shade there might be to get in our hemlocks. And then within the 30% of deciduous species, I'm making sure to include shrubs and making sure, even though it's a small percentage of the overall planting, to have as many deciduous species as I can as are appropriate for the site within that planting.
Brenda, I'm worrying about follow-up monitoring, and Deborah mentioned the very interesting topic of paperwork and tracking, I think earlier. Do you have some sort of system you could share with us? I'm imagining a very intricate, beautiful, elegant Excel worksheet or maybe a database.
You would be imagining wrong. But since Deborah, right now it's all in my brain, and when I do my nursery inventory, I just have in parentheses where the stock is from. But since Deborah mentioned it, I am going to start adding when it was collected, where it was planted out, because I think that's a really good point. And maybe in my brain is not necessarily the best place to put it. Oh, and how it was stored. I usually store all my seeds in the refrigerator with charcoal to try and keep them dry and cool. And then the final thing we've been doing is really extending the timeline of our restoration projects, the stewardship timeline. So no more is it we're going to maintain these for 3 to 5 years and they'll be done. Although we didn't really think that way anyways, but now I'm accepting the fact that, in 30 years, I may have to go back and replant a species. For example, Western red cedar had kind of a bottleneck in its genetic history, and it, unlike other large trees, it doesn't have a lot of genetic variation, and it may suffer a lot during climate change. So I'm accepting that, 30 years from now, I may need to go in and replant all the Western red cedar with something else. We just continue to walk through all of our projects that we've ever planted and keep our eye out for insect and disease issues that maybe we could address with phenols or by planting a different species. And then finally, we're starting to thin a little bit. If there's, for example, at one site we planted Doug firs 15 years ago, which was completely appropriate at the time, full sun, dry. But now the trees are crowding together, and I noticed the needles are starting to die from the bottom up. So we're kind of opening those up to get a little bit more light in there and basically doing what we can to relieve stress on the plants, because I feel like climate change is going to put a lot of stress on those species as it is.
I like the idea of the extended stewardship timeline. Is there any trade-offs between sort of the longer establishment maintenance period versus what you think you can get done in like a normal year under kind of regular conditions? Like, is anything suffering because you're extending those stewardship timelines out?
I find that the extending of the stewardship timelines takes very little time. Like any thinning we do really takes way less time than any of the planting that we did. I walk through the sites once a year. It's not that big of a time commitment. If we find a little patch of invasive species that's really starting to, retake over our site, even though our trees are about 10 feet tall, just going in there and treating that patch once, it's not a huge time commitment.
Thanks. So I'm going to go through a few of the things that we're doing. And one of those is also assisted migration. I refer to our technique or our strategy as assisted gene flow. So really, it happened really very recently, even though there was a couple years of research that went into it. In 2019-20, like last planting season, essentially, my work at Green Sail Partnership, we started sourcing all our longer-lived conifers from the Willamette Valley ecoregion for the CREW projects, specifically in the environmental critical areas. So we also work with volunteers, and generally the potted material that goes out to them is largely locally sourced and grown at our Jefferson horticulture facility or from more regional network of nurseries. So based on, a lot of literature reading, experimentation with the seed lot selection tool, and communication with the network of land managers and restorationists helped to inform that decision for us. I had the sort of pleasure, luxury of, actually, I was probably a little annoying. I was asking the folks that were working on the Stossel project questions years in advance of that project. So I kind of got the benefit of learning, I guess, from other smarter people as we go along and experiment with this. So we essentially source these common conifer species, Douglas fir, western red cedar, western hemlock, within species ranges. So we're not currently utilizing any species that do not currently occur here in the Salish Sea lowlands. And really that adds up to about, from my thinking, probably about 15% of all the trees that we're planting out. So we plant not only trees, but a lot of shrubs and understory species as well.
You had told me that you just recently started tracking the provenance of your seed. Why did you think it was important to start paying attention to that?
Well, I think, it was just more information. It wasn't that much more difficult. It is challenging sometimes to get that information from some nurseries. So I know if y'all are looking at lists and purchasing, a lot of times the provenance will say like Western Washington. So who knows where that stuff comes from? So I think it was just important to dial in our tracking and just provide like a common template to provide to the crews or to the nurseries where they start getting used to us asking for that information. And so they will hopefully start tracking it. But it is important because plants die all the time, right? And you never really know why. Is it because they're maladapted to the new climate? Or is it because it didn't get watered? Or, for some other reason? So I think it's just a little bit more information to inform the survivability out there. So another important thing, just like we're doing today, what we started is what I feel like is important is this capacity building and training and communication, which are essential to designing adaptation strategies. So again, for a few years, we had informal conversations with other practitioners that were facing similar challenges and questions. And then there was lots to learn from other implementation going on around the Sound. And I think there's opportunities to build networks across Cascadia to support each other in a variety of ways. So in April 2020, we convened a group we now call the FAN, the Forest Adaptation Network, and we have met quarterly. So we just had our third meeting to discuss topics kind of relevant to climate disruption and how we adapt. We mostly have talked about seed provenancing up until now, but recently we have linked up with hubs of groups basically moving towards the equator, right? So groups in the Willamette Valley area. And then most recently, a group came on from the Southern Oregon, Northern California area. One of our partners down south is the Bonneville Environmental Fund. They just recently won some funding through the Climate Resilience Fund grant to further develop the Pacific Northwest networks.
Yeah, I think it's super important to get as much input from anyone you can. I mean, like I'm a botanist and you're an ecologist, and we're definitely not geneticists. And this is such a big issue, a big question. So I really value, as many people as I can talk to and as many ideas as I can get. There are a lot of things brought up earlier today that I hadn't even thought about, that it was really great to hear someone else's ideas so I can think about the big picture.
Right. I just think it's another opportunity for us to share information. I do invite everyone on the call, if you want to reach out to us. I just put the link to we do have a web presence now, so we can easily be found. So I put the link to the Northwest Natural Resource Group is really helping to convene the group. So the last thing I wanted to chat about is we talked about, actually, I think Dominique talked about just flooding and more water periodically that moves through our systems. So one thing, I don't know if everyone has this issue, but we respond to landslides, right? Even though we think that during the winter we have these extreme rainfall events, but actually during the summer we had a landslide on Alki Avenue, Alki Beach. I think some of you are familiar with this spot, right? It's some of the steepest terrain in the city of Seattle, behind, these condos that have been developed for years. And we respond a lot to landslides there anyway. And it's interesting because, this coastal erosion is fairly natural and normal. There's even a North Pacific broadleaf landslide forest and shrubland forest type that's pretty common to the Puget Sound or the Salish Sea, made up of red alder, big leaf maple. But obviously in the urban forests, the water moving through the system can be exacerbated by stormwater management and flow off of impervious surfaces a lot of the times. And then we just have intense weed pressure. So if we don't take care to realign these landslides, oftentimes we just get Himalayan blackberry that populates these areas. And so we kind of miss this opportunity to install the desirable plants that we want. And so it is unexpected. We can't really plan for it, but really what we do in order to protect assets like trails or protect our neighbors, in order to stabilize the soils, prevent erosion, protect the streams, we actually we build in a little bit of a buffer, or we call it a contingency of funds, and sometimes even plant material that can be ready during the kind of the landslide season, which we're pretty much into right now.
Yeah, that's a good point to think about what sort of natural disasters could increase because of climate change and occur on your sites. Like in my site, massive flooding, scouring by flooding, and already have a backup plan. And like you said, plants to go in there and revegetate those areas before the weeds start taking hold.
Right. And this is something that expanding our provenancing necessarily isn't going to help to respond to this particular issue that we're talking about. I think we've dwelled on that a lot today, but this is just some things we naturally do to cope with changes in weather or climate, or our adaptation strategies that are really relevant to the discussion.
So we're open to questions if anyone has any. And in the meantime, I thought I'd just talk really briefly about, I think it was Dave who mentioned how looking at your soils could be really important. And I just thought I'd mention how we do our soil samplings, because it's super easy. And I think maybe if you think about testing your soils, it can be more daunting than it sounds. So basically, I just go out with a soil auger, which, drills down and takes a soil profile, and go out and take samples from my planting site. And I learned how to do these soil samples from a retired USDA soil scientist. And he taught me that you don't necessarily have to do a grid across the entire site. You can just go out to your planting area and put in, holes where you are curious what the soils are like, places that look different. And so I find that I can really test the soils in one of my planting sites in like an hour. So I pull out the soil profile and then I follow that texture. I don't know if you've seen it. It's like a texture map to look at, what types of soils they are. And really, to me, for planting trees, that's what's the most important. I find if, a site is sand or worse, the trees really aren't going to live unless I do mulch or something. And then if it's like a sandy loam or better, then usually I have successfully living trees. So I just wanted to put out there that, doing a soil test doesn't have to be a huge, expensive proposition.
So we had a bit of time for questions before lunch, and some folks mentioned that soils were super important, and conservation districts will do some soil sampling at no cost. Also noted was the seed lot selection tool does not take soils into account. The seed lot selection tool being one of the more user-friendly modeling tools designed to help forest managers match seed lots with planting sites based on climatic information. So really the first question that came in was, can you address climate refugees versus exotic invasives? Now, climate refugees was a term that Brenda nor I had really heard about in regards to plants. However, with some explanation, the person was asking about species that are on the move and migrating or dispersing basically north or into upper elevations with warming trends. Species move at such slow paces. In theory, I've heard about this happening over long time scales, but it isn't something we are really seeing or observing, particularly given the fragmentation in the Puget lowlands and other barriers to migration. Going back to the tree hugger episode with Sally Aitken from February of 2020 called Climate Ready Forests sheds more light on this topic if you're interested.
Since we have limited funds, we really focus on treating things that are either on the Washington State noxious weed list or are outcompeting our plants like blackberry or old man's beard. So we really don't have enough funding to just be eradicating every plant species that comes in on its own that we're like, oh, this doesn't belong in this area. I don't know about you, Michael.
Mm-hmm. Right. The undesirable plants that we control are often, on the county's noxious weed list. So we have the regulated noxious weeds, but then we have the whole list that, the A's and the B's and the C's, not all of which occur in the city of Seattle. And then we also have a woody species list that we dedicates a bit of time towards controlling as well, some of which are not on the noxious weed list. But largely, some of these species left sort of untended, if they don't tend to dominate, then we won't worry about controlling them. We'll just kind of accept them as part of the landscape. Next, there was a question about integrated pest management, and conversation wandered towards the topic of erosion control. That was about all the time we had for questions before lunchtime.
In our system, we really want to focus on using as little herbicide as possible. And so we combine prevention of weed spreading, mechanical extraction, and then herbicide use. So prevention would be, I do my walkthroughs of the site, catch starting populations before they spread, paying attention to where you've been and if there is potential for weed seed on your boots, on your equipment. If we do large soil disturbances, making sure we reseed that. Mechanical includes mowing, weed whacking, and pulling. And often I find that combining mowing with herbicide application is more effective than just herbicide application alone. So we do a lot of mowing. We also do a lot of mowing of like pastures that aren't going to get trees, so that any seed heads that come up or any flowers that come up don't get to go to seed for weeds. And then we do use some herbicides. We use the aquatic herbicides that are approved by the state, and we do spot spraying. We never do like coating our sites with herbicide, and then we hope to use less and less herbicide as time goes on and the populations decrease. Our biggest plan is to plant trees and create shade and shade out the majority of weeds. Most of the weeds that we deal with are shade intolerant. Michael?
Right. So generally, I would say the more native-y composition that a forest is, generally we tend to do more handwork. And then, where access is good, we will move in and incorporate more cultural methods, right? Like the mulching, I think got brought up earlier on. And some of the landscapes that are just dominated, like extensively just monocultures of blackberry, we will do a combination of mechanical and or herbicide treatments on things.
Yeah, I wish that we didn't have to use herbicide ever, but there's a limited amount of salmon habitat restoration funds. And I've compared notes, and let's say blackberry, if we mow it and then spray it, we can do about 1 acre per person per day. But if we go in and grub, one person can only do 1/40th of an acre per day. And so, we've really had to make a hard choice if we want to use 40 times more funds and limited funds to treat weeds just to avoid using herbicides. Even if there wasn't a funding issue, at some point you have to justify your benefits for how much it costs. We use mulch more to keep in really well-drained soils to make sure that our trees do well. You probably use mulch more for erosion, Michael.
Right. If that's the outcome we're looking for is to control erosion, we'll use a variety of cover practices. So, mulching is one of those, go-to ones as well. In some areas that are hard to access, we use a product called wood straw, which essentially looks like a bale straw, but it's a recycled wood fiber, and it's very widely used. And then I talked about the mechanical treatments on blackberry. That is a very effective way. A lot of times we do a knockdown and just chop up the canes into like 2 or 3 foot sections and just leave that flat and not to rake it up or remove it. If we're on somewhat of a steep slope, you can rake that material into what we call windrows, right, to break up the contours of the slope. Then there's the fabrics that we can put down too, as well as the wattles and coir logs as well, and some of the beefier erosion control installations.
Wattles are cool. Will you tell us more about those?
Wattles? Oh man, can we do a whole session on wattles, right? So a lot of times we've gone towards a product that's like a burlap encased wattle, right? And oftentimes these are they're always prescribed by engineers, but largely they're really just, in some cases they are somewhat superficial, but they do break up the surface water flow that could be coming across the slope, right? So slowing that water down as soon as possible. I feel like it's important as soon as we have the authority to kind of start to slow the water down, it's important to start a line of wattles or use woody debris that's available on site to start to capture or slow down water, but also capture organic material too. And then subsequently you can go back and backfill and replant along the line of the wattle that tends to hold a little bit more moisture that's beneficial like in the spring and during our droughtier spring and summer times.
Lunchtime.
Thanks for finding Tree Hugger Podcast again and listening into this discussion with Brenda Clifton. You can find out more about her work, and our Forest Adaptation Network in the show notes at treehuggerpod.com. Please take the listener survey if you can. I already received a pretty decent suggestion that I do a show about how the Biden-Harris administration is impacting the restoration field. This was cool. We have had 2 updates on the global restoration decade, even talked about China as a whole, so scaling to the federal level in the U.S. is probably worth some attention. Let me know if someone is familiar with a guest that could expertly speak to this subject. I did give it some thought though, and out of curiosity, I did a bit of digging because no one ever hears administrations of the colonial state really talk about ecological restoration. The next 100 days might be where some of the campaign promises are kept, so here's a bit of highlights we could track. Back in November, Society for Ecological Restoration sent an open letter to the Biden-Harris administration transition team. The letter attempted to school the incoming administration about employing ecological restoration as a way to address climate, social justice, and biodiversity challenges. SER made recommendations for Biden's first 100 days, which included rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement, reinstate Waters of the United States rule, support the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, address environmental justice, and lastly, apply sound science in decision-making. Perfect. Like we've been missing that the last 4 years. It has mostly been campaign promises until a few days ago when the transition of power took place on January 20th. The ball is already rolling on some of these issues given the intense advocacy that people have directed at Biden since he rolled out his campaign. Executive orders have been signed on some, and we will have to keep organizing around others. I could outline a few more to track related to restoration, climate, justice, and livelihoods that I am watching. So one is directing all federal agencies to undo Trump's environmental damage. There was an executive order on protecting public health and the environment and restoring science to tackle the climate crisis. The word restoring was in there, which explicitly directs all heads of federal departments and agencies to harmonize their orders, regulations, policies to center public health, our environment, and the national effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Number two, rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. I think there will be a process to officially rejoin, especially a series of aggressive domestic climate policies to help us meet the goals outlined in Paris. 3. Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline permit, which Trump expedited despite high-profile protests in defense of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe's water supply and land. End border wall construction. In a proclamation issued on his first day of office, Biden ended all funding of border wall construction while also elevating human rights in the U.S. immigration strategy. Transborder conservation is crucial along the U.S.-Mexican border, and the wall has driven an immense physical barrier through the middle of ecosystems and desecrates sacred ancestral lands. Number 5, restore national monuments. Trump's restructuring of Bears Ears was a huge blow to the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition, a group of tribal governments that work closely with the Obama administration to formalize the monument. A Biden executive order helps to restore the boundaries of 2 national monuments in Utah, Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante, and ensure indigenous peoples' co-management of public lands. Biden's nomination of U.S. Representative Deb Haaland as the Secretary of the Interior has also given Indian country reasons for hope. 6. Temporary halt oil and gas leasing in Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. The Republicans forced fossil fuel drilling in this area through the 2017 tax bill. Biden is delaying the process as much as he can through this executive order. He directed the Attorney General to request courts currently litigating on the issue to pause the current lawsuits. Lastly, number 7, sign the 30 by 30 Biodiversity Preservation Initiative. I haven't heard much chatter on this, but there is a promise related to this one. The Decade on Ecosystem Restoration calls on countries to conserve 30% of the world's land and marine spaces by 2030 through the 30 by 30 pledge. Protecting nearly a third of the planet could help us meet the Sustainable Development Goals. The Biden administration has vowed to put the U.S. on track to meeting this conservation target. Already, 12% of the land and 26% of marine areas are protected in the U.S. through national and state parks, wilderness areas, wildlife refuges. How do we get the rest of the way? Can you say land back? Anyway, those are the high-level things to watch with the new administration. I am cautiously optimistic at this point in time, but Democratic politics. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. We are on social media at Tree Hugger Pod, so feel free to point people in our direction. Subscribe, rate, and review the show, please, on whichever podcast platform you enjoy listening to. It helps people find the show. And please tell a friend about the show. You can now donate to the show, too. At the Tree Hugger website, there's a PayPal link. Podcasting isn't free. If you are in the position to donate some funds, it would help to offset some of the show's costs. Thanks for considering. Music for this show was from Young Logos. Thanks for hanging out. See you next time.